Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We are talking about 1984 by George Orwell, and Brent is going to give us the setup.
Okay. Winston Smith is a party member living in London. He, like every other member of the party, is under constant surveillance. Despite the risk, he decides to buy a blank book and begin to write down his thoughts. From the first moment he writes down with Big Brother, he believes he's doomed to die in the torture chambers below the Ministry of Love. Will his deviance be caught, or will Winston succeed in finding a way to resist the totalitarian control of the party?
I'm Cody Troyer.
And I'm Brent Gaisford.
And we are the Hugonauts, here to review and discuss with you the best sci-fi novels of all time. Like we said, this week it is 1984, which is about 328 pages or 11 and a half hours on audiobook. It's likely that most of you have come across it somewhere on your life's paths.
If you haven't, you should. We're going to tell you why. Anyway.
Yeah, it just becomes more and more prescient. It was published in 1949. And then next week we are doing...
Next week we're doing Spin by Robert Charles Wilson, which is from the 80s, I believe. Is that right? The 80s to the 90s? It's from a time period that is sooner than 1949. That I know. Of that I am sure.
Yeah, 2005.
Okay, great. I was off by 25 years. So, all right, so let's get into 1984. What did you think of it?
1984, I gave it 4 stars. I was waffling, maybe like a 4.5. I don't know. I was waffling. It's not like a perfect book for me. There's 5s that I like love more, but it's great. I mean, it's the archetypal dystopian novel pretty much, even though it's not the first one of that kind. But it's archetypal for a reason. And as you said, it just keeps getting more and more prescient. I mean, Orwell just understands human nature and understands like power dynamics really well. So it doesn't age. How about you? What'd you think?
I gave it a 5 stars. I think it's the most realistic of all the dystopian novels. And the one that's also like most chilling when thinking about current dictatorial surveillance states, which are like actually starting to exist. And they always existed, like with the East German secret police. But like, anyway, they're getting way more and more scary. And like the technology, which he sort of envisioned in 1984, is becoming real to enable that surveillance at like mass scale. And it's really scary to think about what it's like to live in one of those states and how it could possibly ever end. Anyway, 5 stars for me. I really loved it.
Yeah. And, wrapped up, it wouldn't be that high of a rating, which I can see why you gave it 5 stars. Wouldn't be that high of a rating if it wasn't also like a compelling read, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I like the plot quite a bit. There's a really interesting thing where the whole book, Winston is foreshadowing like extremely strongly. Like, I know the fact that I'm even having bad thoughts about the party means I will be caught and I will be tortured in the Ministry of Truth or Ministry of Love, which is a great name for the torture chamber. And I will be killed. But the whole book, as a reader, you're like, yeah, but I don't believe him. Like, it's gonna work out, right? And like, we're not gonna spoil for you what happens in the end, but it's just a really interesting device. It's like the most strong foreshadowing ever. It's just a character telling you like very directly, here's what's gonna happen to me.
Well, it works well with the plot, right? And the world of 1984, because that foreshadowing brings you in more to the sense of foreboding. Like, even if like nothing is to happen from Winston's foreshadowing, it feels right that he feels that way because of the surveillance state, right? So it has a dual purpose, which is interesting.
And for sure.
And I also think it's a fascinating example of world building meets plot. Like, you're driven forward, you're turning the pages, but you're really getting this excellently built, but not too detailed, so you can really take it all in and make it your own. The world of the party and what it must be like in the party's Britain. I guess it's not even Britain anymore. It's supposed to be.
Oceania.
Oceania.
There's 3. We can do a little setting the stage. There's 3 countries left. Oceania. So London, it's North America plus Britain plus South America plus South Africa, and then it seems Australia
yes.
And maybe like some parts of the South Pacific and South Indian Ocean. Okay, so there's Eurasia, which is like all of Europe, and northern central Asia, and then East Asia, which is East Asia.
Yeah.
And
which is actually, I looked at a map. East Asia is like basically just looks like it's like China and Japan. Eurasia is like Russia and all that other stuff. Anyways.
Oh, interesting. Well, they have Korea and like Southeast Asia too, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, that's like that's like a quarter of the world's population, which is about right. It's just like
no, it makes sense.
Densely populated place on Earth.
It just looks funnier on a map,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, whereas Russia is like, oh, what a big country with like 6 people in it. Anyway, yeah. So
in case none of you have ever run into the difference between population and geography before.
Yeah. We're both tired. We're both dads now. Oh, I had my kid. Woo!
Yeah.
You got to say that about on the podcast. That's why we're late.
Double newborns.
Yes, for sure.
So anyways, what I was saying about the...
back to what's important here.
Yeah, what I was saying about the world building meets the plot is it's rare to get such a this world really sticks with you. And I think that's why the book is so famous and has lasted through the ages, is because everyone creates, it feels real. It feels like an interesting world to think about and apply your own life to and your own thoughts to and things you see in the world too. But it's also really compelling and page turning, which is amazing. I think we should start with, instead of going to themes, we should start with science and technology, because there's a little bit of gripey there, because it's, the book is 75 years old. So let's start with our gripes, since it's not really a gripe book.
Sure. So the main technology is telescreens, which are TVs that also listen to you and watch you, basically. So you don't know if there's someone from the Ministry of Truth. Is that right? Is that the right ministry? No, that's his ministry. What's the surveillance state one? The secret police one? It's the Ministry of Love,
Peace,
right?
Love, War. Yeah, I think Love is. Yeah.
Okay, so you don't know if there's someone from the Ministry of Love watching you on the other end, like literally just in your house. You can't turn it off. They're all over the city. They're all over his workplace. But you don't like the always listening aspect, right?
Yeah, I mean, I just, it's like the zoom and enhance kind of thing that we say, you see in CSI and a bunch of other shows that we know is long debunked, where, you can just zoom in and make the quality of an image better, even though, no, you can't. Same thing goes for audio. Sound is being harvested from the air. It's not, you can't like you can in certain ways, but you can't generally just like plant microphones everywhere and hear what people are saying. Sometimes you'd hear what people are saying, and a lot of times you just hear blah, blah, blah. Like you just like wouldn't be able to. I think lip reading is almost a way more accurate way of spying on a populace.
Interesting.
At least it is now. But yeah, those are the only like, the technology is a little bit dated, but of course it is. He wrote it in 1948. And actually it still feels pretty relevant.
And the actual modern version of it is like monitoring social media and the internet with algorithms to look for people who are, not towing the party line. And so, yeah, he didn't foresee that, but it doesn't really matter because it still feels like totally right, which is like, can I even have a thought that's not in keeping with what the party wants without them noticing? And I think his sort of foresight of that is totally accurate and makes sense. It's different technologies achieving that for the dictatorships of our age, but it's still being achieved.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I think gives it so much staying power, as well as his understanding of, like I said in the review, human nature and power structures, governments, social structures. That he understands what makes people tick, and that's what makes the novel a classic.
Yeah, for sure. So there's some really interesting themes in the book. So let's start with Winston's job. So Winston works in the Ministry of Truth, where they tell lies. So his job is to alter all the records of the past so that anytime the party said something that turned out later to not be true, they just go back and edit what the party is supposed to have said so that the party is always right. So there's a great saying. That's one of the 3 main sayings of the party, which is he who controls the past controls the present. He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past.
Right.
And so the idea is they just have all these employees who are dedicated to changing all the records of the past. So there's like no written place anywhere or any photos or anything to know what really happened in the past. And so then the question becomes, does the past even exist anymore if it's literally impossible to know what happened? Or can they literally change the past? If you have enough power to change every record in the world, can you change the past? And it's a really interesting thought experiment and a very unsettling one. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think he succeeds in pointing out that you can at least change it in the practical ways that matter, right? If you can wipe it from all the memories of the populace, then what practical significance do the real events of the past have? If they're not being...
and if you can't control everyone, like they're not successfully controlling Winston. Winston remembers all kinds of times that for instance, at the beginning of the book, I believe they're at war with Eurasia, and he's like, yeah, but I remember 4 years ago we were at war with East Asia, but the party says we've always been at war with Eurasia, and like I know for a fact that's false because I am more than 4 years old. How is everyone else like not noticing this? But anyway, so you can't control everyone, but you can control maybe enough of the people that they don't ask questions.
Yeah. And maybe this is a good time to just talk briefly about how, directly this book is written about, the events of let's say, starting with the Great Depression. I feel like it touches on through World War II and post World War II, because that idea is directly based on the relationship between Nazi Germany and Russia, and the way that the two governments' propaganda talked about how they were allies and then they're no longer allies, and no one's allowed to say that they changed. It just never happened. So like a lot of events in this book, it's just directly based on that time period, pretty much. Yeah.
Well, and his personal life as well. I mean, he is like deeply committed to the values of like human rights and dignity. He went to Spain to fight against the fascists in the Spanish Civil War, risked his life. He got shot in the neck. He almost died. But then while he was there, a bunch of the people fighting against the fascists were communists, but he wasn't a communist. He was fighting alongside the communists. But while he was there, the communists ended up labeling him and a bunch of the people he worked with fascists because they wouldn't get on board with communism. And so all the communists were spending all their times on like lies and propaganda about him, calling him a fascist. Well, he literally was there just as a volunteer getting shot by fascists. And he's like, well, screw you guys do that. You're horrible. You're just as bad. So then he wrote this great scathing book where he points out, I think very rightly, that like, no matter what you call it, all like party-based dictatorships are basically the same. Like call it fascism, call it communism. But like if there's one entity in control of every aspect of civilization and they're doing all these same kinds of lies, like it's the same thing. So anyway, he went into it like being like, I don't know how I feel about communists. And then he got shot trying to help them. And then they were like, oh, you're a fascist. He's like, actually, screw you guys.
Yeah. There's also a bunch of awesome, it's really cool terminology that he's invented for the party that fits in to the themes that is thematic to the book. One of them that I loved, you had one you loved. Mine was doublethink. This idea that everyone in the party is supposed to hold two ideas in their mind at the same time, like you're talking about the remembering who's the ally and who's the enemy at any time. You're supposed to both, if you're a party member, you're supposed to both remember the real thing a little bit because you need to be able to determine your next action to like dictate controlling the population. But you also need to pretend that the false thing is true, and you need to hold both of those in your mind at the same time. And then it can be applied in different ways. You can bring down people by saying that they are using doublethink, by saying that they're pretending something that is literally wrong, but the party thinks is right, is wrong. And you can also, and then the party members need to use it themselves to be able to argue for things that are literally wrong, but the party thinks are right. Anyways, there's a lot going on. It's a confusing phrase to begin with. But I think what's the most interesting about it is I feel like the version that we're dealing with today that's actually come to fruition is different than Orwell's version. and maybe even more devious. We could see media companies capitalizing on people's desire to believe what they think is true, even if it may not be true, and just putting out false information in the form of articles, or even just like the smallest crumbs, like in a meme, just saying like, yeah, so and so said this, and then put it on a picture of them and release it, and people, since they want to believe it, will then take it as fact, and run with it, and throw it everywhere. And then it becomes a large narrative false fact. And I think that has a lot to do with 1984, but is slightly more devious because it plays on our biology and our emotions, not just in 1984. It's more about deny reality.
Well, that's the version that like works in democracies, but like in dictatorships, they do the 1984 version too, where like, I don't know, Vladimir Putin says like, yeah, we're invading Ukraine because they're a bunch of Nazis who are trying to kill us. And it's like, that's actually just totally entirely false. But he's saying that, and it's working. I just read a really depressing article. His approval ratings within Russia have gone up since he invaded Ukraine. Even though all these Russians are getting killed, he's pursuing this war for totally unjust reasons. But like, as 1984 points out, like war stirs up nationalism and it gets people excited, and like dictators know that. So they do war because they want to stay in charge. And they do propaganda and like all this stuff. You're just totally spot on about like the way you manipulate and control people.
You make a really good point. And maybe that means it's even more terrifying. There's just a way dictatorships do it. And now we've discovered that there's a way that it can be done in democracies too.
Yeah, for sure.
And what was yours? You loved NewSpeak.
I really like NewSpeak. Yeah, NewSpeak is one that I don't think actually has ever been used in the real world, although I would love to hear if somebody knows about a dictatorship where they try to change language. But the idea of NewSpeak is they've come up with a new language where they get rid of words and ideas so that people literally won't even be able to think contradictory thoughts. Like the word freedom, for example, they just have gotten rid of. And the idea is eventually, once they can get everybody speaking NewSpeak, no one will even have the idea of freedom because there is no word for it. It's a deeply disturbing idea. And I think generally right. I mean, there's a lot of interesting sci-fi books that look at this idea of like language is sort of like the programming language of our brains. And I think it's mostly right. It's pretty hard to think of ideas that you don't have words for. It sort of takes a long time anyway to sort of figure them out. And so, yeah, I think the idea of NewSpeak is like deeply unsettling. Yeah, I'd be really curious to hear, I don't know if there's any dictatorships that have done that and tried to change language, but if so, let us know in the comments.
Yeah, I mean, we have dictatorships who eliminate the use or try to eliminate the use of certain words, but not like fundamentally change the structure of a language. Just a couple, one more little thought I had that was a side thought, speaking of dictatorships. How come leaders still do the big portrait thing? 1984, you got Big Brother with the mustache. I mean, it's basically like it's a portrait of you on the wall staring at everybody. But
I am not Big Brother. It's a much. I'm a nice guy. He's a scary guy who's watching
your face.
I protest. Okay. Just because I have a mustache, I look like a dictator.
Look a little bit like the book cover guy of Big Brother. You're not. You don't have as. You don't have as much. You're not as flabby in the cheeks, I suppose. You don't have as much meat on you.
Yeah, I'm. Thank God I'm not portly, so that's saving me. Okay, awesome.
So now that we've established that you're Big Brother, I think that the portrait thing is just so silly.
Chairman Mao did it all over China in the 70s. It's like, yeah.
And it still goes on. You've seen him in North Korea. I mean, I guess, none of the people of those nations are seeing the parodies of the portrait. So they're not aware. So maybe it still works. But
I guess, but even just at a very fundamental level, like if you, let's say I am Big Brother. If I put my face all over our country and was like, just pick giant pictures of my head, which is what the dictators do. Would that make you think I was a nice guy? No, I would be like, yo, that guy must be a giant fucking tool. What a douche who's putting his face everywhere. Like, but I don't know. Anyway, I mean, I guess you sort of have to be a douche to want to be a dictator. So maybe that's it. They're just like so full of themselves. Like, yes, this will work.
Fear only thing.
This will work.
Which is why I also, the funniest example I've seen of it in the antithesis, that is not a fear only thing, it's an inspirational thing, is that they have in Hanoi these like painted posters of Ho Chi Minh with like 5-pound dumbbells doing morning exercise that basically say like start your morning right, or like get your exercise in. They're like little,
is Ho Chi Minh still alive?
No. They just have these posters that are painted, like the 1960s style, and they're still around.
I thought it was like a Ruth Bader Ginsburg exercising thing where they had like really old Ho Chi Minh doing his weights that are like inspirational.
That's basically what it is, but just like that 1960s like advertising art style where the whole thing is painted to look real. Anyway, those are great. Love those. So, and then you had a word you loved from the book.
Oh, yeah. This is, let us know if you like this idea, but there's a word in here that I was like, oh, what an interesting word. I've never seen that one. We could do this in general with books if you like it. But yes, there's the word persiflage, which means, let me quote it exactly, light and slightly contemptuous mockery or banter. So it'd be like, you said, he said with an air of persiflage. So anyway, yeah, I've never seen, well, maybe I have seen that word before and I didn't notice, but now that I know to look, maybe I'll see it. But anyway.
Yeah, and use it as at a dinner party where everyone says, what?
Yeah, well, that's kind of the thing with new words like this. If no one else knows it, is it that useful?
I don't know.
Question.
Ask Ingsoc.
Yeah, great point. Yeah.
All right. So what are some similar books before we get into post spoilers? Why don't I start? Yeah, I'm going to start with Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. Take the idea of controlling the world from 1984, make it all about nuclear weapons, then make the nuclear weapon a metaphor that's silly and make the characters silly and all the happenings silly like Kurt Vonnegut does. And you've got a similar, an of the times book about what happens when the few have too much power. Great novel.
Yeah, great one.
Ice Nine Kills.
Ice Nine. Oh, is that it? I forgot anyway, I just remember Ice Nine. Nine Kills.
Yeah.
Okay. I think everyone should read Animal Farm the same way I think everyone should read 1984, like pretty much no matter where you live, who you are, like 1984 is worth reading, as is Animal Farm. Animal Farm is about a farm where a bunch of the animals get fed up that they're the bottom of the totem pole and they take over the farm. And, then it gets, obviously that's already an allegory, but being in charge has some effects on them that are very interesting. Anyway, it's such a good book. And similarly, like I think the same reason 1984 is timeless, Animal Farm is too, because it's about this like human nature stuff that we don't like, but that I think is really important. And when you think about setting up societies and rules, because it's good to remember that actually maybe not everyone is a good person, and there are certain just circumstances that can make some people into not good people. And so you need to make sure you don't set up your society in a way where those people end up in charge of things, or if they do end up in charge for things, it's just for a short period of time and not forever. Anyway.
Yes, you're right. And in a similar vein, we also have Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, of course. It's just similar ideas, but instead controlling populations through letting them have fun instead of bludgeoning them into doing what you want. And then breeding your labor castes, well, in everybody really. But kind of like same general ideas as 1984, but an opposite way to get people to do what you want.
Yeah, it's like control them not with fear, but with like drugs and orgies and orgy porgies. Yeah.
Orgy porgies. Man, you found a way to say that again at some point on the podcast.
I love it. Not enough people watched that episode of ours. It's one of my favorites because it was so funny. If you have not listened or watched to the Brave New World episode, you really should get to learn about orgy porgy Ford and fun. Anyway, okay, great.
Yeah. Have some orgy porgy Ford and fun. All right, let's do a post spoiler. What happens in the rest of the book, Brent, in 3, 2, 1?
Okay, so Winston's thought crime is noticed, but by another thought criminal. This woman who he works with, Julia, notices that he is, she's following him and he's going to these shops that he shouldn't be going into. Anyway, she gets really interested in him and she dares to give him a note that says, "I love you." And so they scheme a way to meet up, and they start having this affair where they're going to like these crazy places out in the woods and stuff where they think they're not being watched. So they're having this wonderful time. And then Winston has this idea that this inner party member, like a head honcho guy at his work named O'Brien, is in on what's called the Brotherhood, which they think is this resistance. Anyway, so they go and meet O'Brien, and he tells them, yes, I'm part of the Brotherhood. Here's the secret book with all the details. We'll be in touch with secret missions. So they go back. Oh, also they've rented a room in like the lower class section, which is supposed to be unwatched. So they're like going to the same place regularly. They go back there, they're reading the book. And then the thought police show up, the secret police show up, arrest them. They've been getting watched the whole time. O'Brien was faking. It was so obvious he was faking. I couldn't believe they thought he was being for real when they were in his house. Come on, Winston. Normally you're so with it. Yeah. Anyway, and they get arrested. They get taken to the Ministry of Love, and they get tortured, just like Winston thought they would. But the most interesting thing that happens is that there's two interesting things that happen. One, they're torturing him not to get confessions. They get those right away, but they don't really care about that. They're actually torturing him until he will truly believe that this dictatorship is the right thing. And it's a good thing. They're
brainwashing him.
They're brainwashing him. Yeah. It kind of feels like the end of Clockwork Orange. Ooh, which maybe we also should have had in the recommendation list as I'm saying that. Clockwork Orange, also a great book. Okay. And the other thing that they do is they describe some of the things about why the party works, which we will talk about. I don't need to tell you in the summary. But yeah, so that's kind of what happens. And then he gets murdered at the end, just like he always said he would. So yeah, the foreshadowing was real. It was even knowing what was going to happen, having read the book before, as I was going through, I was like, I just still didn't want to believe. But yeah, the end is exactly what he always thought it would be.
I think that was what was most interesting about a reread, because I think a lot of times when I reread a book, I remember the plot, and I don't remember maybe some of the more interesting ideas or like the characters, like the emotions I felt, that kind of stuff. 1984, all I remembered was the ideas. I didn't remember any of the plot. Basically.
Oh, you didn't know he got caught?
No. I mean, I knew he got caught, but I didn't remember that he died. I didn't remember that it worked. I didn't remember like how it all came together. I just remembered like the thematic stuff that really stuck with me, which you kind of felt differently about on your reread. My biggest takeaway the initial time was about the central idea that, the party or any government, any organization can, the difference here in 1984 with the party, quote, is that they don't care about anything but power. They're not building the society based on anything but having power and maintaining power. There's no ideology behind it, whatever. And that's the only way, power for power's sake, to maintain power indefinitely. And that has really stuck with me as an idea. But you actually thought that
actually hit me on reread. That actually hit me as false, because it's not just power for power's sake. Because I actually think most dictatorships do that. I think all the ideology and stuff is fake. It is totally just about the people in charge being in charge. But people in charge don't just want to be in charge. In 1984, they're basically saying like all the members of the inner party are sadists, and we want power because we would love the feeling of like torturing people. Like, I am taking visceral pleasure in torturing you right now. That's why I am creating that. Like, that's why this society will persist. And it's sort of an interesting idea is like, okay, this thing will persist because they keep like finding sadists to be in charge. Anyway, but in the real world, what dictators do is they take money and they want status, and like they're people. He gets so much right about human nature. The thing that feels wrong about human nature is like, actually everybody does want more. He basically says like, oh, if I just, if we keep the population so poor, they wouldn't ever think of revolting. But like, that's not true. It doesn't matter how poor, people, like, there've been tons of revolutions led by poor people who are like, we're tired of being poor. Just because you're so, because you're poor doesn't mean you don't have time to like want more stuff. And I think the dictators also want more stuff, and people around the dictators want more stuff. And like, that's usually how the power structure, I feel like, eventually crumbles, is like when too much of the society ends up being about corruption and taking, and then some of the other people in the society are like, well, screw this. They're clearly just taking from us. Let's take the power back. And that always seems to happen. Every empire always falls. So I thought it was a really interesting idea, and this is maybe just me being optimistic, but like in my heart of hearts, do I believe like a relentless dictatorship can persist forever. Like, no,
just based on the reward.
I refuse to
sadism.
accept that. I don't know. Yeah, I just like can't have that be true.
Yeah, I think there's also, at least it's internally consistent, because I wouldn't have believed it as easily if the inner party members were getting treated so much better than everyone, and they're getting,
their lives
like you
sucked
said,
too.
stuff.
Yeah, it was so weird. I was like, why are you doing this?
But that's internally consistent, at least,
yes,
because you could, in theory, maintain power in that way if no one was getting extra, that much extra luxury.
Right, because the proles aren't like, oh, they're stealing from us.
Yeah,
they're not.
And
they're just like doing secret tortures.
We really just like doing this. So I think you're right that it did ring a little more hollow this time, but it's still a compelling idea to me.
Well, and the thing I like about the idea is I do agree that's the point of dictatorships, and like, communism it has existed in the world today, right? Like, do I think Lenin and Marx like really thought that everybody, all the wealth of society should be shared equally? Yes. But how long did it take before, but the state they created was a place where like individual people or a very small number of people could be in charge of what happened to the resources of society. And it took one generation. Lenin just had to die. And then the next guy in charge, Stalin, was like, oh, great. Well, I'm just going to take all the shit then. Who cares about everyone having equal stuff? I want all the stuff. And that happens pretty much every time. It's not like it doesn't do well with generations. No. Once you give all the power to a small number of people, it doesn't take very many iterations before one of those people is like, oh, I could just take everything. Like, well, I'm gonna.
Much like the other thing that happens where, a wealthy family will have the next generation be like, well, I'm not going to do anything. I already got all this stuff. And then, it comes and goes in waves. The another idea that I was super compelled by, though, was the way that they brainwashed them was, O'Brien keeps saying, I'm going to make you change your mind about the party and change your mind about yourself. And I was like, okay, how are we going to, I'd forgotten about this on my first, on my second reading. And I was like, oh, what kind of pseudoscience or magic are they going to use to pull this off? But what they do is they turn Julia and Winston against each other by showing them like the thing that they're most viscerally afraid of, and then asking them if they would swap in the other one, the person that they love, into their position to take that punishment instead. And they both agree that yes, they would. And so they run into each other in the denouement. And it's awkward, and they don't want to be around each other anymore, and they don't love each other because they've both been in a situation where they know they gave up the other person to an unfathomable torture to save themselves. And that does feel like an effective tactic of changing someone's, mind at a core level.
Like destroying their belief in themselves and goodness. Yeah. Sure.
And that was a pretty particularly brutal, that I think stayed with me more this time than the power idea that you can change someone's mind at that level, at least that way.
Yeah. Getting him to agree that 2 + 2 = 5 was real interesting though. It's like, can you torture me enough that I would he wasn't just saying he thought 2 + 2 = 5. He was like legitimately being like, yes, 2 + 2 is 5.
Right.
And that was it's just an interesting level of control. I don't know. Maybe if you torture somebody long enough and they were giving him like crazy electroshocks in his brain and like, I don't know, sure, maybe it works. I don't know. It's crazy.
Yeah. That one didn't feel as compelling to me, but it was an interesting part of the book. Also taken from history. I think that was a Soviet campaign for production. 2 + 2 = 5 meant they wanted to get their 5-year production plan done in 4 years, and it was like pasted everywhere. That
interesting.
The slogan 2 + 2 = 5. So he just sniped that and made it even more like basic and literal.
That's interesting,
which is cool.
Well, on the note of Julia, we should talk about. So Julia is a really interesting character. I know you have one gripe about their relationship, which is fair. We should get to, but she also has one of the takes that I liked most in the book. So the party is like strongly against sex, especially sex, like any enjoyment in sex. They tell everyone that it should be like only for the purpose of making babies. That's your duty. And it's a really common thing you see in dictatorships as well, right? Like Russia has like all kinds of crazy laws against LGBT people. And it's like super conservative sexually. And her argument about why they do that is because it makes people pissed off. Like if you can't, basically, here, let me just quote it exactly. She has this really great line. All this marching up and down and cheering and waving flags is simply sex gone sour. If you're happy inside yourself, why should you get excited about Big Brother and 3-year plans and the 2 minutes hate and all the rest of their bloody rot? And so her point is basically like, well, yeah, of course they don't want you to get laid, because then it just like makes you chill out. And when somebody says something dumb, you're like, oh, that's stupid. Instead of being like, yeah, I'm pissed. So anyway, felt right.
Yeah. And once again, you know, the opposite of the Brave New World, like let everyone do that all the time. And then you can do whatever you want with, you know, with the power you have now. And it, you know, plays out in different ways, but it does, you know, this in 1984 does feel effective. It feels like she's making a good point. But as you were alluding to, I do think that there was a little, you know, their relationship is a little bit like he's a middle-aged man and she's like this young vixen who suddenly falls for him and they fall in love and have sex all the time. And it just felt a little bit fantastical. That was like one of the only elements of the book that I was like, okay, I mean, this is a little bit stupid, like the old school, like science fiction writer stuff we're used to writing about women and relationships. But I do think
he doesn't do, in his defense, what I will say about Orwell, he does not do any gross body part descriptions. No one of her breasts boobily anywhere. He's not like describing Julia's body in great detail.
That's true. It's not one
of those, like sometimes you read an old sci-fi book and you're like, oh God, this is disgustingly sexist. This isn't like that. This is just like, do hot young women go after like middle-aged men with varicose veins? Like, you know, not usually.
Yeah. Yeah. Do they want to? No, not usually.
Probably could if they'd wanted to.
So what else do we have here? We've got, it's science, you know, the party that talks about how science is concerned with only finding a new weapon and that we don't need human labor really anymore. Quote, the fields are filled with horse plows. Books are written by machines. Some things never change, right? Or at least like the discourse about where the world is heading seems similar right now with AI, art, and automated labor and factorization.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, thank God also we're not plowing the fields with horse carts.
Right.
Machines are doing both.
It's an analogy.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, cool. Well, there's just one other thought I had, which was about war. So they talk about why they're making these endless wars. And basically the point is to like whip the population up. I guess we talked about this before with the Russia-Ukraine example, but anyway, it just felt very true and spot on. Like it's one of the number one go-tos. It's like, oh, how do I make my population like accept me? Well, look at those other people who are different than you, who are horrible. It's just like Dictators 101. So yeah, that felt very spot on as well.
Yeah, it sure did. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from 1984, which is also why it's taught all over the place and read all over the place and discussed all over the place. And we wanted our chance to talk about it. So we decided to do that.
Boom. Here it is. If you haven't read it, you should. If you have read it, I hope it was fun to revisit and think about. And don't vote for people who want to be dictators. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah. All right. See you next time for Spin.
Bye.